The crowd huddled at the gates of the royal palace, where, as if from another time, guards in immaculately cleaned uniforms stood still. Silent and unwavering, they looked like living statues. But even in this majestic moment, there was someone who decided to break the boundaries of respect. The tourist stepped forward from the dense ring of gawkers. His large figure, wearing a brightly colored t-shirt with a slogan and a baseball cap whose shadows fell across his smug face, was unsettling. He reeked of arrogance, like a man who was used to taking his own without regard for the rules. Crossing his arms over his chest, he stopped in front of the guard as if he were preparing for a duel. "This is your legendary royal guard, then?" he said mockingly, in an accent that might have made him sound like a visitor from across the ocean. "Standing there like mannequins in a shop window. I wonder if any of you can move?" The crowd gasped. Someone snorted quietly, but that wasn't enough for the tourist. He stepped closer, his heavy boots stomping loudly on the ancient stones of the sidewalk. His smile was sinister, his eyes burning with challenge, as if he were savoring every second of it. "Hey, kid," he said, leaning a little closer to the guardsman's face. "Are you even human, or just a doll in a uniform? How does it even feel to stand here all day long like a badge of honor?" The guardsman did not move. His gaze remained fixed forward, as if he had not heard that contemptuous voice. But there was something frightening in his immobility, an iron strength beyond influence. This did not suit the tourist. "Look at him," he shouted, turning to the crowd. "Do you see it? Zero emotion. This guy is a robot, no other way." He raised his hands theatrically, as if to encourage people to laugh. "What if I do this?" He extended his arm sharply, almost touching the uniform button of the guardsman. Some of the spectators gasped, some hissed indignantly, but the tourist only grinned. "How about this?" He began circling around the guard, raising his arms and making loud noises, imitating a rooster. With each circle, his actions became more and more disgusting. In his movements, in the grin on his face, there was a clear desire to humiliate, to reduce him to nothing. But the guardsman didn't move. Even when the tourist lifted his foot, as if about to touch his boot, the guardsman's face remained stony, and that only added fuel to the fire. "Are you even listening to me? Or is it your job to be just a beautiful statue?" the tourist shouted, switching to a shrill tone that began to irritate even the indifferent. The crowd began to murmur. One of the gawkers tried to stop the tourist. "Leave him alone, it's his job." But the tourist only turned around with a wide grin, as if feeding off their indignation. "A job? Well then, let's see how well he does his job when someone really decides to piss him off." With these words, he bent sharply, as if he was going to touch the face of the guard, and at that moment the tension in the air reached its limit. The crowd froze, as if all around them had stopped breathing, waiting for what would happen next. He stood like a rock, unwavering, majestic, his scarlet uniform, his buttons polished to a shine, his tall, bare helmet. Every element of his uniform spoke of tradition, honor, and dignity. The royal guardsman, the silent symbol of the state, was the epitome of impenetrable calm. The tourist shouted and gesticulated, but the guardsman, like a bronze statue, did not respond with a movement or a glance. His face, tanned and smooth-shaven, seemed carved from marble. Beneath his helmet, you could see the hard, barely visible angle of his jaw clenched with inner tension. He was not devoid of emotion, as the tourist thought. No, every provocation touched him like the stab of a sharp knife. But duty and honor kept him within bounds. This man had been brought up in an environment where any show of weakness could be taken as a defeat. His silence was not indifference, but greatness. The crowd, as if mesmerized, watched as the tourist continued his disgusting performance. The man began to raise the stakes, shouting words that pierced the air like poison arrows. "You think you're better than us? Standing here, playing soldier. Is that the best you can do? Tell me, do you even realize who you are?" The tourist looked around the crowd meaningfully, raising his hand to point to the guardsman's helmet. "Look at him. His whole job is to keep quiet like an idiot in that ridiculous hat. You know, we have them at home to entertain the children at the holidays." The guardsman did not answer, but his eyes, fixed on a single point in front of him, spoke more than 1,000 words. It was the look of a man who was used to scorn and ridicule, but never let it touch his core. His body, stretched out in a perfect stance, said one thing. He was ready to endure anything. But the tourist didn't stop. "Or maybe you're just scared," he continued. His voice became more mocking, imbued with cruel satisfaction. "Afraid that if you move just once, your little secrets will come out? I bet you think that uniform makes you special. But you know what? It's just a rag, and you're nothing." Someone in the crowd hissed with indignation, but the tourist didn't even pay attention. His eyes glittered with cold gloating. The guardsman stood like a guardian of time, his stillness tearing space. Inside, deep down, pain burned, but it did not touch his face. He didn't look at the tourist, didn't react to his words, as if he ignored the man's existence. To the guardsman, this was more than service. It was his life, his honor, and honor could not be defiled by words. "Hey, I'm talking to you. Do you know what I'm saying? Or are you still acting like imperial soldiers?" The tourist shouted, adding a sneer to his voice. "Maybe you've forgotten that the world doesn't belong to you anymore?" The words, soaked with racism and contempt, fell on the guardsman like heavy stones. But he remained steadfast. His immobility was a challenge, a silent declaration that pride and resilience cannot be broken. His professionalism was not just a job. It was a tradition passed down from generation to generation, a symbol of fortitude and loyalty. Every day he stood guard, knowing that it was his duty to protect not only physically, but also morally. This tourist, with his pathetic provocations, did not understand one thing. No blow with words could destroy the greatness of a man who had dedicated himself to something greater. The guardsman remained speechless, and there was more power in that silence than in any answer. And the tourist, possessed by his anger, continued to stoke the fire. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, and have you had something similar in your life? Maybe you've faced similar provocations or seen someone maintain their dignity in a difficult situation. Be sure to share your opinion. It's important. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation of this and other stories. And now, we continue. The tourist took a step away from the guard, like a predator looking for a weak spot in its prey's armor. His smile grew wider and his movements more insolent. Now he was no longer just a spectator, but an actor in his own violent play. The crowd watched tensely, no one daring to intervene, but everyone sensed that the situation was heating up. "Let's see how steadfast you are, my friend," the tourist whispered, snapping his fingers loudly in front of the guardsman's face. "Or is it just an appearance?" The guardsman did not move. His hands, clenched tightly on his rifle, did not tremble. His immobility only fueled the tourist's excitement. He took a step closer, breaking boundaries that were invisible but sacred. Only an inch separated them now. "What if I did this?" said the tourist, chuckling, and reached out his hand, trying to touch the epaulets of the guard. His fingers had almost touched the fabric when a harsh whisper from the crowd made him turn around for a moment. "Don't touch him. This is too much." "Too much?" The tourist grinned and turned to the crowd. "He's not a human being. He's just another toy of the British monarchy. I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm just checking to see what he's good for." Returning his gaze to the guardsman, he leaned a little closer, almost touching his face. His voice became a low, snake-like hiss. "You know, you're just part of this circus. You must be all like that here, standing there, silent, pretending to be superior to others. But we know the truth, don't we? You're all the same." He glanced at the guardsman's face as if searching for a weakness in it, a crack in the armor. But nothing. The guardsman continued to stand like a statue, his gaze fixed on the horizon. This equanimity inflamed the tourist's rage. He took another step, close, so that his boots were now almost touching the polished boots of the guard. Then, with deliberate slowness, he raised his hand and touched the brim of the bear's helmet. "What? You're not hot under all that? Or are you just used to following orders like an obedient dog?" The crowd murmured again, the indignation in their voices growing louder, but the tourist was deaf to them. His attention was completely absorbed by the man in front of him, that silent, imperturbable symbol of strength. He seemed to want to see that fortress collapse. He suddenly clapped his hand sharply right in front of the guardsman's face. "Are you made of stone? You won't even move? Come on, show me something." A moment of silence, thick as a storm cloud, hung over the square. The guardsman did not move. His immobility was more humiliating to the tourist than any response. The crowd held its breath. People gazed into the guardsman's face, trying to figure out what he was feeling. But the face was serene, as if all these provocations were happening somewhere else in the world. The tourist gritted his teeth, his face contorted with a mixture of anger and frustration. He decided to move on. "Well, if you don't say anything, then you agree with me, right? That means you admit you're just a puppet. You know what else? I think all you guys know how to do is pretend. You have no pride, no honor. Maybe you should go back to where you came from. Maybe it would be easier for you there." The words, soaked with contempt and racism, echoed through the crowd. Someone exclaimed, "Enough already! Get out of here!" But the tourist was deaf to this. His voice grew louder and louder, his movements more and more aggressive. He began to circle around the guard, waving his arms as if he wanted to physically destroy the motionless figure. It wasn't just a test of patience, it was a challenge to everything this man represented. And yet, despite this, the guardsman did not waver. He stood as the embodiment of strength, his silence louder than any shout. The tourist, driven by rage and hatred, did not realize that with every attempt he was only showing his weakness. How far would he go? The crowd froze, anticipation hung in the air. Everyone knew there was no turning back. The tourist, stunned by his supposed victory over the silent guard, had now crossed a line beyond which his behavior ceased to be merely rude. It was turning into something more sinister. His eyes were glittering with gloating, and his voice had a caustic note that indicated his true intentions. "You know what's funny?" he began, now addressing not only the guardsman but the crowd as well. "These old-fashioned uniforms of yours, all this circus, you still think you're great conquerors, don't you? That you have an empire here?" He laughed, waving his arms around like an actor playing a villain on stage. The guardsmen continued to stand motionless, but the tourist seemed to sense that his words were beginning to break through the armor. "Look at you. You think you're standing here defending queen and country? You're nothing but a lowly servant." He emphasized the last word as if it were the most offensive. "And you know what's worse? In your country, they probably still believe that you impress someone." He stepped closer, lowering his voice to a hissing whisper that only the guardsman could hear. "But we both know the truth. You're only here because you were made. People like you couldn't exist without orders from above. You're just a tool, like your ancestors. Nobody and nothing." The crowd began to whisper, the tension in the air becoming unbearable. Some of the spectators moved away. Others watched the guardsman's face intently, trying to catch the slightest sign of reaction. The tourist raised his voice again, emphasizing each offensive word. "Your ancestors must have stood in that uniform just like that, thinking they were superior to the rest of us. But do you know how that ended up? I'll tell you. Nothing. Nobody remembers them. Nobody's going to remember you. You're just another statistic working for someone else's glory." His sneer grew more and more venomous. He raised his hands and looked theatrically around the crowd. "And you people, don't you see? This is a farce." He can't even answer, probably because he doesn't have an opinion, or because he doesn't know how to defend it. The guardsman, despite the cruel words, stood as before, but his jaw clenched a little tighter. Only those who scrutinized his face could notice how his eyes grew colder, as if he had put an invisible wall between himself and the attack. The tourist didn't stop. He moved on to the most painful topic of all. "Do you realize that you're standing here for people who don't even see you as an equal? You're just part of their act, another tool in their system. You're here so all those rich tourists like me can come and make fun of you. You're their clown." The crowd began to murmur louder. A woman in a red coat shouted, "This is too much. Somebody stop him." But the tourist only laughed, his face contorted with satisfaction. He liked to feel like the center of attention. He turned to the crowd again. "What about you? You all just love this show, don't you? Watch me ruin this farce. Where's his pride? Where is his great self-control?" He leaned sharply toward the guardsman, his voice turning into an almost dull whisper. "You never had it. You've never had any real pride because you're a nobody." With those words, he slapped his hand on the guardsman's shoulder as if he wanted to see if he would move. The guardsman didn't react, but there was a fire burning inside him, behind the mask of absolute calm, a fire he knew had to remain invisible. The tourist, enjoying the silence he mistook for victory, took another step forward, another lunge. But he didn't even realize that with every second he was not undermining the guardian's dignity, but rather showing his own insignificance in the face of true greatness. The crowd froze. There was a question in the air. How long could this go on? And what would happen if the line that the tourist could not see was crossed? The crowd around the royal guard gradually became more and more restless. The originally silent spectators who had come to admire the solemn spectacle were now unable to take their eyes off the unfolding scene. Smartphone cameras lit up in the hands of the spectators as if they were silent witnesses to what was happening, and muffled whispers and shrieks mingled with the distinct voice of the tourist who continued his dirty show. "Well, people," the tourist addressed the crowd loudly, extending his hand towards the guard, as if he were presenting him as a participant in some absurd performance. "Isn't this what you've come to see? Look, here he is, the real hero of your great kingdom. Or do you all, like him, just prefer to keep silent?" A few people drew back, averting their eyes, but there were also those who laughed. Their laughter was not loud, more like nervous laughter, but the tourist took it as support. He turned to the guardsman and continued his taunts, now addressing him directly. "You hear that, boy? Even your countrymen won't stand up for you. Why should they? You're just part of their old museum. They want to keep you here as a monument to their former successes, but you don't really mean anything to them. No one will even notice you if you disappear, because you're nothing." The crowd stirred. People began to glance around, some of them looking at the tourist with disapproval, and some of them expressing their indignation softly. One elderly woman with a cane tried to intervene, addressing the tourist. "Leave him alone. It's his job. He can't answer you." But the tourist just waved his hand, waving it away like a pesky fly. His voice became even louder, his words even more aggressive. His job? His job is just to stand there like a dumb mannequin? Maybe instead of puffing himself up like that, he should learn to respect those above him. Or maybe he doesn't even know what I'm saying. Maybe he's not used to being spoken to as an equal. These words caused some in the crowd to hiss with indignation. A young couple, standing aside, began to whisper, condemning the tourist's behavior. But there were also those who watched the video without interfering, as if what was happening to them was not reality, but part of some performance. One man in a cap even grinned and said to his companion, "Well, he's just standing there. What's the big deal? A little fun would be nice." Someone else, more determined, shouted out, "That's enough. Leave him alone." But the tourist only seemed to feed off this reaction. He turned to the shouted man, waved his hand, and replied with a wry smile, "What? Do you want to be here for this guy too? Or do you just want to be his lawyer?" Then he turned to the guardsman again and, raising his voice, added, "You see, even they can't decide what to do with you. You just stand there and everyone else watches. Maybe because that's what you're all about, being nothing and being nothing." Now there were different voices in the crowd. Some demanded that someone call the police, others tried to call the tourist to order, but there were also those who remained on the sidelines, as if mesmerized by this heated atmosphere. Some of them even filmed videos commenting on what was happening for their followers. "It's crazy. Look, he's just messing with this guy and he doesn't even move. Did you hear that? He said the guardsman was a nobody. That's a tough one, but he's not saying anything, right?" But there was another, more disturbing whisper sounding from the corners of the crowd. "It's too much. He's overstepping his bounds. Why doesn't anyone do anything?" The tourist seemed to enjoy this mixture of indignation and inaction. His hands were now lightly and casually touching the guardsman's shoulder and helmet, and his words were becoming more and more barbed and insulting. "Come on, boy. Show me you're not just a useless puppet, or are you afraid you're worthless without that uniform?" The crowd began to close in, as if the magnetism of this conflict was pulling them into the center of events. The cameras continued to record every word, every gesture, every moment. The tension became almost physically palpable. Everything now depended on how long the guards could withstand this onslaught. Everyone in the crowd understood. Something must happen. The only question was what. The king's guard continued to stand motionless, but a conflict was brewing inside him that no one could see. His face remained cold and impenetrable, his gaze directed somewhere far away, beyond the square, the crowd, and the hateful words that were being hurled at him. But inside he felt each insult like a red-hot blade plunging into his soul. His training, his years of service, his discipline had all hardened him for such situations. He knew that duty required absolute endurance, that his job was to symbolize a strength and majesty that could not be broken by word or action. But each new lunge of the tourist was like another blow of the hammer on this armor, carving hardly noticeable cracks in it. "Look at him," came the tourist's voice again, this time imbued not just with contempt, but with something more sinister. "He thinks he'll win if he keeps quiet? But you know, boy, silence is not strength, it's weakness. It's a sign that you're too cowardly to respond." He leaned even closer, almost touching the guardsman's face, his voice turning into a venomous hiss. "You're afraid. Afraid to admit that you're nothing, that you're just part of a system that uses people like you and throws you away when you're no longer needed. What's the saying? You're just another cog in the machine. You're not worthy of this mold. You'll never be equal." The guardsman could feel the tension building inside him. The tourist's words were penetrating his defense, which had been built up over the years. They were not mere insults. They hit him in the most painful places. His pride in his service, in his country, in his uniform, all of it was now being questioned. But he knew that to give in would be to betray everything he stood for. "Come on, show me you're human," the tourist insisted, snapping his fingers loudly in front of his face. "Or are you not even capable of that? Maybe you're just a puppet who can only move when told to? I know your kind. You will never be our equal." The crowd around them held its breath. Some of the spectators tried to intervene, but their voices were drowned in the growing tension. The cameras continued to record what was happening, and the guardsman knew that his every gesture, every movement, would now be seen by millions. That thought helped him to remain steadfast, but something inside him was crackling. He felt his jaws clench tighter, his hands tense on the gun as if they wanted to snap out of their own accord. The urge to respond was almost unbearable. He could have easily turned around, just one step, just one word, and this humiliation would end. But he knew that would have been a failure. It would be the end of his honor. "Can you hear me at all?" the tourist continued, almost shouting now. "Or can you only obey like an obedient dog? Tell me, do you feel human when they look at you like a piece of jewelry? You mean nothing. Do you understand? Nothing." The guardsman froze. His gaze remained fixed forward, but inside he was seething. His thoughts wavered between duty and rage. He remembered the words of his mentors. "You are the face of the kingdom. You are its symbol. The symbol must not crumble." But in this moment, he didn't feel like a symbol. He felt like a human being who suffered injustice, hatred, contempt. "Maybe you don't understand me at all." The tourist suddenly laughed, wrapping his arms around the crowd. "Maybe he doesn't even speak English. They probably just found someone who agreed to stand here like a mannequin and gave him a nice uniform. Does anyone know where he's from? Maybe he's not from Britain at all." Those words were the last straw. The guardsman felt his fingers involuntarily clench tighter. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. His thoughts flashed through his head like lightning. You can't break. You can't let him win. This isn't about you. It's about something bigger. The crowd, sensing that the tension was peaking, stirred. Some spectators began to express their displeasure with the tourist more loudly. Some shouted for him to stop, but the tourist only laughed and joined the chaos created. He looked straight into the guard's eyes, trying to wring out even a speck of emotion, even a hint of weakness. "Come on, man, do something, or are you afraid to show your true colors?" The guardsman stood. His face remained stony, but his eyes grew colder and his breathing a little heavier. Inside, he knew he was at his limit. But this limit was his choice. This was his battle. And he knew he had to win, even if that victory meant silence in response to every humiliation. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, and have you had something similar in your life? Maybe you've faced similar provocations or seen someone maintain their dignity in a difficult situation. Be sure to share your opinion. It's important. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation of this and other stories. And now we continue. The crowd around the guardsman began to thicken like thunder clouds before a storm. People could not take their eyes off the unfolding scene in which the tourist was becoming more and more aggressive. His provocations had long since crossed the line, but he seemed to be obsessed with getting even the slightest reaction from the motionless royal guard. His actions were becoming more insolent, humiliating, and downright cruel by the minute. "Are you made of stone?" he shouted, snapping his fingers in the guardsman's face again. "Or do you just not understand human speech? Maybe you're the kind of person who was brought here to stand in uniform and be silent. Or maybe you're not even considered worthy." He paused to look around the crowd as if seeking support. His words grew louder and louder as the thunderclaps echoed through the square. Now he was acting out an entire scene, mimicking a guardsman with an exaggeratedly stony expression on his face, stretched out in an amused stance. He held back his laughter as he watched the crowd's reaction. "That's it, isn't it?" he continued, mockingly mimicking a guard. "You just stand there, silent, doing nothing. I guess that's the only thing you're good for." A few people in the crowd hissed. Someone began to protest softly, but the tourist didn't care. He stepped even closer, his face almost touching the guardsman's. The smell of his cheap perfume mingled with his hot breath, and his voice became hissing and sarcastic. "Or maybe you're just afraid. Afraid to show your true colors? You know why you don't say anything? Because you can't say anything. You're here because you're being controlled. You're just a toy in the hands of those who think they're better than you. And what are you? Just following orders?" He laughed, but there was something evil, almost animalistic in his laughter. Then, turning to the crowd, he raised his hands as if addressing an audience on a stage. "Look at him, people. There he is, your great royal guardian. Is he the protector of your country? Is he the face of your empire? And once upon a time you thought you owned the world. But now, look, this is your level." The crowd was buzzing. Many already looked frankly outraged. A young man with glasses shouted, "Stop it! You're overreacting." But the tourist only shrugged his shoulders, his smug smirk not disappearing. He felt that he was the master of the situation. Now he turned to the guard again, his tone even harsher, almost hissing. "Do you even understand what I'm saying? Or are you just standing there because you can't count on anything else? Maybe in your country you wouldn't even be allowed in a place like this. I guess you should be thankful that you've been given this uniform and at least here you look significant. But you know what? You don't mean anything." The guardsman didn't move, but there was a storm going on inside him. He heard every word. Those words were like poison seeping into the cracks of his mind. He knew it was his job to stand, to be silent, to be a symbol. But each insult struck at his human dignity, making him shudder inwardly. He wanted to respond, wanted to just step forward and stop this torrent of filth. But he couldn't. He was more than just a man in uniform. He was part of a tradition, part of a great mechanism that required his absolute endurance. The tourist, feeling that words were no longer enough, decided to take action. He slapped his palm sharply on the bare helmet of the guard, and the sound echoed through the square. The crowd gasped, and someone shouted loudly, "What are you doing? This is too much." But the tourist only grinned and struck again, now a little harder. "What's up? Come on, boy. Do something. You're a human being, aren't you? Or are you just a puppet in that funny hat?" The crowd began to move, approaching the stage. People could no longer remain indifferent. Someone tried to take out his phone to call the police, but the tourist continued his show, not noticing anything around him. He hit the guard on the shoulder again, trying to make him react. Look, he's not even twitching. He probably doesn't feel anything at all. That's what your heroes are like. Empty, cold, useless. The guardsman continued to stand. His hands were clenched on his rifle. His gaze was forward, but his jaw was tightly clenched. Inside, he was fighting with himself. Every instinct was screaming at him to respond. Every nerve in his body was ready to snap. But he knew it would be a victory for this man. And he couldn't let him win. The crowd started shouting. People were divided. Some demanded that the mockery stop, others filmed what was happening, and some even encouraged the tourist, considering it a joke. The tension in the air became almost unbearable. Everyone realized that the situation was close to exploding. The guard, standing as the embodiment of steadfastness, and the tourist, assertive as a storm. Their confrontation turned into a spectacle from which no one could take his eyes off. And at that moment, the whole world stood still, waiting to see what would happen next. The crowd around the guardsman became not just an observer, but part of what was happening. Unpleasant tension was spreading like a fire, engulfing everyone who stood in the square. Some began to loudly resent the tourist's actions. Others, on the contrary, cheered him on as if it was just a harmless amusement. But the air was becoming thick with emotion, and the tourist seemed to enjoy his power over the situation. He kept circling the guardsman, slapping him on the shoulders and tugging at the edges of his uniform sleeve as if testing the limits of the man's patience. His face, twisted with gloating, became even more smug when he saw that the guardsman remained motionless. "Look, people," he shouted, waving his hands. "Here he is, your paragon of courage and strength. Zero reaction, zero feeling. Maybe he has no soul at all. Maybe they just took the first one they could find. Well, you know where from. Maybe he's only here because no one else wants him." Those words were like an explosion. There was an outcry from the crowd. A young woman in the crowd shouted, "Stop it! It's humiliating! What are you doing? He's doing his job. Leave him alone." Another voice, belonging to an older man, echoed. But the tourist only grinned, turning to those voices with a mocking expression on his face. "A job? This is his job? Standing here like an idiot and putting up with everything? Well, then I'm just doing my job to show everyone that it's all bullshit. Maybe he's not even human. Maybe he's just a doll in nice clothes. That's what they're all like, isn't it? One form, one order, but none of them are our equals." The crowd began to divide even further. Some people tried to make their way forward to intervene, but were stopped either by fear of the tourist, who seemed increasingly aggressive, or by fear of repercussions. Others laughed or filmed what was happening on their phones, not realizing that this moment could be a point of no return. The tourist, feeling the center of attention, decided to take the next step. His eyes burned with a thirst to destroy everything this silent guard symbolized. He reached up and grabbed his helmet, pulling at its edge. "Let's see what's underneath. Maybe there's nothing under there at all. Maybe he's just part of their show." The guard, in spite of his outright humiliation, did not move. His hands still clutched his rifle tightly, and his eyes remained fixed forward. But the crowd held its breath. The tourist kept yanking his helmet until it tilted. The noise of the crowd grew louder. People were shouting. Some desperately called for the police. Some shouted insults at the tourist. But there were also those who applauded his actions, seeing it as a kind of challenge to the authorities. In a moment, the helmet flew off the guardsman's head, and the crowd gasped. His thick, dark hair, glistening with sweat, was exposed in the summer sun. The guardsman remained standing as if nothing had happened, but that moment was the turning point. The tourist raised his helmet high above his head as if showing off his prey. "Look, this is your hero. That's all that's left of him. Without that hat, he's nothing." The crowd began to boil over. Some shouted at the tourist, demanding that he stop this show immediately. Others continued to laugh, not yet realizing the seriousness of what was happening. But the tourist, inspired by his victory, went even further. He threw his helmet on the ground and, looking back at the guard with a sneer, took a step forward. "What if I do this?" he asked, lifting his foot and kicking the helmet roughly, which flew off a few meters. The crowd gasped again. This was no longer just a provocation, it was outright humiliation. And at that moment, something in the air changed. The guard, who had been standing like a stone statue until then, raised his chin slightly. His eyes met the tourist's for a moment, and there was a power in that gaze that made the man freeze. But it was only an instant. The tourist, embarrassed for a second, immediately straightened up, trying to look confident again. "What, boy? You got something to say to me? Go ahead and do it. Or do you still think standing there silently is the best you can do?" At that moment, something happened that shocked everyone. The tourist, seeing that his actions still did not evoke a clear reaction from the guard, abruptly raised his hand and grabbed the rifle he was holding in his hands. This movement was so unexpected that the crowd shrieked. No one could believe that he had gone that far. But the guardsman didn't give him the slightest chance. He intercepted the rifle lightning fast, not allowing the tourist to take it away, and raised a gaze that was as cold as steel. It was the look of a man who had held out to the last, but was now forced to show that the limits of his patience had been crossed. The crowd fell silent, as if time had stopped. The tourist froze for a moment, sensing real power before him. His smile faded, but he tried to maintain a semblance of confidence. At that moment, however, everyone realized that the situation was out of control. A voice from the crowd cut through the silence. "This is too much. Somebody stop this before it gets worse." No one knew how it would end. Everyone in the crowd realized that further development of events could become a point after which there would be no turning back. The crowd around him froze as if the whole world had stopped, waiting to see how this scene would end. The royal guard, who had stood like a stone statue before, was now the embodiment of strength and steadfastness. His silence, so annoying to the tourist, suddenly took on another dimension. It had become a weapon to destroy all attempts to humiliate him. Even now, as the helmet lay on the ground and the tourist continued his provocations, the guard did not move an inch. The tourist, sensing the growing tension, turned to outright rage. His face turned red, his voice rough and almost shrill. He could not accept the fact that his efforts had produced no result. Waving his arms again, he shouted across the square, "Are you even dead? Or do you think not talking will make you better? You're a nobody, do you understand? You're nothing. You're only standing here because you have no talent or intelligence. They just gave you this uniform to cover your worthlessness." He leaned closer, almost touching the guardsman's face, and hissed, "Maybe you're not saying anything because you know it's true. Maybe you realize I'm right. Look at you. You're not a hero. You're just a servant, always standing in the shadows, never on an equal footing with the real people." The guard remained motionless. His face expressed not a shred of emotion, but steel glinted in his eyes. That look was a response that was impossible to ignore. He was saying, "I am stronger than you. You can shout, provoke, humiliate, but you can't break me." The tourist sensed this mute challenge, and his face contorted with anger. "Oh, is that so? You think you're taller than me?" he shouted, grabbing the helmet lying on the ground and raising it high above his head. "You think you're better just because of that damn uniform?" With those words, he threw the helmet to the ground with such force that it echoed across the square. The crowd gasped. Some people covered their faces with their hands, not believing that a tourist had gotten that far. But even that didn't elicit a reaction from the guardsman. He remained standing like an impregnable fortress. His immobility was the epitome of absolute control and dignity. This silence began to affect the tourist differently. It was not indifferent. It was overwhelming. The tourist, realizing this, suddenly felt small, despite his loud words and aggressive actions. His provocations, which should have humiliated the guardsman, turned against himself. The crowd that had previously laughed or condemned now looked at the guardsman with respect. Everyone realized that in this situation he was stronger not with his words, but with his silence. But the tourist was not going to give up. He felt that his power over the situation was slipping away and tried to grab the last chance. He became louder, his gestures sharper, his words even more offensive. "You're not going to say anything, are you?" "Of course not. Because you don't have a voice. People like you never had one. They put you here as a dummy because they know you're incapable of anything more." He jabbed a finger at the guardsman's chest, trying to make him blink. But the man stood like a pillar of iron. His hands clutched his gun, his gaze forward, his face impenetrable. The crowd began to whisper. Someone in the audience muttered, "It's incredible. Look how he's holding up. I'm surprised he's still standing." I couldn't take it. The voice of a woman from the crowd came through louder. "Leave him alone. You've already shown who's weaker here." The tourist, hearing this, turned to the crowd, his face twisted with anger. He glanced at the woman and shouted, "Weaker? You're kidding me. I'm showing you the truth. He's just afraid, you know. He's afraid to even move because he knows I'm right." But his voice no longer had the effect it had before. Now the crowd began to lean toward the guardsman. Silence, which the tourist had considered a weakness, had become a symbol of strength. People saw how this man, who had been subjected to incessant insults, retained his dignity, did not stoop to the level of the offender. The tourist, realizing that his words no longer had power, made a final, desperate move. He picked up the rifle, which the guard held firmly in his hands, and pulled on it. But the guardsman, as if anticipating this moment, held the weapon firmly. His movements were minimal but confident. He didn't let the tourist get the upper hand. Their gazes met, and in that instant, the whole world seemed to freeze. It wasn't malice or hatred in the guardsman's eyes. It was the look of a man who had already won. The tourist, for all his screaming and violence, was broken by that one look. He backed away, his shoulders slumped and his face contorted with helplessness. The crowd broke into a low murmur, which gradually grew into applause. The people who had been spectators a short while ago now realized that they had witnessed true fortitude. The guardsman, silently returning to his motionless position, became a symbol of courage and professionalism for all. His silence shattered the brutality he faced. In that moment, everyone who stood in the square understood. Greatness lies not in words, but in maintaining one's honor in the face of humiliation. When the tourist finally retreated, there was a deafening silence in the square. The whole world seemed to stand still, digesting what had happened. The guardsman stood, motionless as before, his face reflecting nothing but concentration and calm. His gaze remained directed into the distance, showing not a shadow of emotion. He still held his weapon tightly, but now it wasn't a gesture of self-defense. It was a symbol of his dignity, of his unwavering strength. The crowd began to disperse. Some people stepped aside, trying to digest what they had just seen, while others lingered, casting judgmental glances at the tourist. The woman in the red coat, who had earlier tried to defend the guard, finally gathered her courage and loudly addressed the tourist. "You just humiliated yourself in front of all of us. This man has shown what it means to be strong, and you are nothing but weakness. Shame on you." Her words were echoed by others. There were shouts from the crowd. "Get out of here." "Component placement. Shame on you. Component placement. He's better than you." The tourist, who a moment ago had felt like the king of the stage, now looked lost. His shoulders slumped and his eyes darted around looking for support. But there was none. Those who had previously videotaped the event with a chuckle now put down their phones. Even the most indifferent began to turn away from him as if he were something dirty. Someone in the crowd had already called the police to report the hooliganism. A few tourists tried to appeal to the common sense of the man standing in the center of attention, but he just waved his hand, unable to withstand the stares he was getting from all sides. His rage, as well as his self-confidence, was gone, leaving only the pitiful remnants of his former superiority. The guardsman stood as he had at the beginning of this tragedy, but now he was more than just a soldier in uniform. His image, his silent resistance to all humiliation and insult, had become a symbol of strength. His every action, or rather lack of action, spoke more than all the screams of a tourist. He showed that true power lies not in shouting louder, but in remaining calm in the face of hatred. The tourist realized at some point that he was alone. No one supported him anymore. No one laughed at his jokes. All he had earned was hatred and contempt. He cast one last glance at the guardsman, as if trying to find even a shadow of emotion in him, but found none. That look was the final point in his defeat. The tourist stumbled away from the square, and the people behind him whispered. Someone started posting the video on social media, adding their comments to it. This is what true strength means. This guard is a hero. While some are shouting, others are showing strength with silence. Within hours of the incident, the video went viral. It went viral across the internet, sparking an avalanche of discussion. People from all over the world admired the stamina and professionalism of the guardsman, who did not allow himself to be humiliated despite all the pressure. The media picked up the story, making it the top story of the day. The headlines of newspapers and online publications were full of phrases like, "Silence against hate, a lesson in dignity." A royal guardsman shows what it means to be a professional, the power of calm, how one man silenced hate. The story began to grow with comments from experts, psychologists, and public figures who said that it was not just a clash between two people. It was a battle of ideologies. People began to recognize the guardsman's name, his biography. He became a symbol not only of honor and duty, but something more. A reminder that even in a world full of hatred and aggression, one can remain true to one's principles. His face appeared on magazine covers and his actions were discussed on talk shows. As for the tourist, his face became a symbol of shame. People condemned his actions, and in comments under the video and articles wrote, "This man is an example of how not to behave." He thought he humiliated the guard, but in fact, he humiliated only himself. His attempts to justify himself to friends or on social media were met with even more condemnation. The world turned its back on him, just as he turned his back on common sense and respect. The story is over, but its lesson remains forever. The guardsman, who never uttered a word, showed the world that dignity and serenity are stronger than any words and insults. His silence was louder than all the cries. It shattered hatred and left only respect. This lesson will remain in the memory of everyone who was in that square, who saw that video and who realized that true strength is the ability to preserve oneself even in the most difficult moments. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you ever experienced racism in your life or seen someone maintain their dignity in a difficult situation? Your opinions are incredibly important to us, and we really appreciate each and every one of you. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new stories, and give us a like if this story touched you. We wish you a good day and peace in your soul.